Now, the Khawarij are a very important sect, and the first manifestation of them is actually during the lifetime of the Prophet himself, which is very bizarre if you think about it. Because the Prophet is actually the lawgiver. He's the actual person who is teaching us Islam. He's the one whose words are actually, his words are law, his words are doctrine. You can't really argue with what he says, because he's the one who's giving us Islam. So how could a deviant sect arise actually during his own lifetime? It's bizarre, but it actually happened. We're going to just quickly mention the hadith. So if you look at Sahih al-Bukhari, now it's in all the books of hadith, but I'm just focusing on Bukhari as an example because obviously Bukhari is the most authentic of all the books of hadith, but in all the books of hadith, there are hadith about these people, the Khawarij. It's a very, very strong hadith to the point where Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in the commentary of Bukhari, he says that we have at least 25 Sahaba that have narrated hadith about the Khawarij. So it's mutawatir, in other words. Mutawatir meaning one of those very rare hadiths which is narrated by so many Sahaba that we can have absolutely no possibility that it could be false or inaccurate. There are very few hadiths that get to the level of mutawatir. You have to have at least 10 Sahaba, according to some ulama, to make it mutawatir. So it's interesting, then the Prophet ﷺ, that means that he was repeatedly warning the Muslims about these people. It wasn't just one hadith he said one off time to someone. You know what I mean? It means the Prophet ﷺ was repeatedly warning the Sahaba about this group, about these people. Now, as far as I know, the Prophet ﷺ has not warned against any other group from the Muslims on this level. There's no warnings about Shia. There's no warnings about, there are some hadiths about some Muslims will go fanatic about Sayyidina Ali, like the Christians went with Sayyidina Isa, for example. But there's none of these type of hadith warning, very severe warning about these groups, and that you should actually fight them and kill them if you come across them. So this is very, very important. And as I say, in our time today, the awareness about the Khawarij has become very much obscured and buried, because it's not in the interest of many people to be highlighting these things. And there's very powerful lobbies and very powerful funding for groups that are propagating the Khawarij doctrine today. So the awareness amongst the Muslims is very low. So the question, are these people still around today affiliated to the original group? Not affiliated to the original group, because it's not that type of group that has got that sort of continuity. This is a type of group that arises almost in every generation, we see it historically, that follow the same type of doctrines and the same type of teachings. Although they would not say that we follow those, for example, the leaders of that very first group. But they are around today, that's what I'm trying to say. And there's many, many Muslims that are influenced by these teachings today that don't know they're influenced by these teachings, because they don't know that they're Khawarij. So there's many sincere Muslims out there, very sincere Muslims that I'm sure many of us know, that have been heavily influenced by Khawarij teachings without knowing it. Because as I say, these people are posing as Sunnis. So it's very important for ulama today to be highlighting these issues and bringing them back to the forefront, which is partly why I'm writing this article at the current time. Anyway, so Bukhari, for example, has a chapter on the Khawarij, and the title of the chapter is The Obligation on Fighting and Killing the Khawarij After Presenting Proofs to Them. So first, you try to debate with them, they're Muslims. They're Muslims, we accept they're Muslim. But if they don't accept, and then we have to fight them, because they're very, very dangerous people. The reason why they're dangerous is because they kill Muslims. That's what they do. They make takfir, they declare Muslims to be kafirs, they take up the sword and they start chopping heads. That's what they do. So there's a reason why the Prophet ﷺ is warning the Sahaba so much about these people, and not warning the Sahaba about other groups. Now, Imam al-Bukhari, in the chapter of the Khawarij, he starts with these hadiths of this incident that happened during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ himself. And this incident, basically, this person came up to the Prophet ﷺ when he was distributing the zakat money, on one occasion. And on another occasion, the Prophet ﷺ was distributing some booty from the Battle of Hunayn. And on both occasions, this person, it was probably the same person on both occasions, but we're not sure. Because in some narrations his name is mentioned, and in some they're not mentioned. He just mentioned that he was a Bedouin. This man comes up to the Prophet ﷺ in front of the Sahaba when he's distributing this wealth, and he says to the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Muhammad, very rudely, not using his kunya, but using his first name, like the Sahaba would never do that. Ya Muhammad, i'dal, be just. I do not see you dividing this justly. And so he's accusing the Prophet ﷺ of unjustly dividing the wealth. And the Prophet ﷺ became very angry, about this. And he said to him, if I'm not just, then who's going to be just? And in other narrations said, I swear by Allah, you will never find anyone that will be just amongst you after me, and so on. And some of the Sahaba, they jumped to their feet and they said, Ya Rasulullah, allow us to strike off his head. Because they recognize that this is a gross deviation, accusing of the Prophet ﷺ, of doing essentially a major sin. Remember what I was saying before about how they accuse prophets of doing major sins? This man in front of Sahaba, he's actually accusing the Prophet ﷺ of doing a major sin, because that's what it is. If you're sort of, you're embezzling or distributing money unjustly, that's a major sin. So this is the description of the man in one of the narrations. A man with a big beard, high cheekbones, deep set eyes, protruding forehead, and a shaved head. And he said, fear Allah, O Muhammad. He says to the Prophet, fear Allah. Ittaqullah. The Prophet says in one narration, who would obey Allah if I disobey him? But the Prophet does not allow the Sahaba to kill him, because the Prophet says, I don't want people to say that Muhammad kills his companions. In other words, from outside, it would seem like the Muslims are killing each other. From the outside, this guy is a Muslim. He's got a big beard. He's outwardly a Sahabi. He's someone who's a Muslim. And the Prophet didn't want that to be said or that to be happen, that Muslim are killing Muslim. Now, the Prophet then said, surely from the stock of this man come a people who recite the Quran, but it does not go beyond their throats. In other words, it doesn't impact the heart. They kill the Muslims and spare the infidels. This is one of their main things they do. They're always fighting other Muslims. They're always killing other Muslims. This is one of their features. And they do that by making takfir, by declaring other Muslims to be disbelievers and committing major sins and doing shirk and bid'ah and things like that. They pass through Islam like an arrow passing through its target. If I were to come across them, I would surely destroy them as the Ad were destroyed. They pass through Islam like an arrow passing through its target. In other words, if you shoot an arrow, a strong arrow, and it strikes the target like a deer, and it goes clean through. Because the arrow is so powerful, it goes straight through the deer, and it comes out the other side, and you can't see any trace of the deer on the arrow. That's how the Prophet ﷺ is saying how they passed through Islam. You can't see any trace of Islam on them, in other words. The Prophet ﷺ described them as having no Islam inside their hearts. So outwardly, they're very Islamic. They're praying, they're fasting, they're reciting Quran, they've got big miswaks, their jalabiyas are very high up over the ankles, all that stuff. But in the heart, there's no Islam, there's no Iman at all. It's like the arrow is passed and there's no trace left on the arrow. So as I say, in some narrations, the man's name is mentioned as Dhul Khuwaisira. And if people are interested, I do have a translation of the commentary on this chapter of Bukhari. So a very extensive summary about the hadith, about the Khawarij. The other interesting thing is that Dhul Khuwaisara was probably not alone. You know, the indications from the hadith are that there was probably a small group of them even at that time. You know, because in some of the narrations, the Prophet says, him and his companions, they're like this, you know. So he was probably not alone. He was probably the spokesperson. There was already a little group of them during the time of the Prophet. Now, these same people may have been among the people that came to criticize Sayyidina Uthman. So once again, I'm not saying this is a definite fact, right? But the indications are all there, and many of the ulama have identified that these they were known as the Qurra at that time. You know, the reciters, because they used to recite Quran so much and worship so much. Yeah. So these are people, they're accusing Uthman. Remember, Uthman was accused of also giving money to his relatives. Can you see the similarity with what happened to the Prophet? It's the same people, same group. I'm convinced. I might be getting paranoid here, but I'm convinced it's the same people. Because the same thing, they're going to the leader of the Muslims, a righteous, pious man, a leader, and they're accusing him of things. The same way they accused the Prophet, the same way they accused Ali. And down the centuries, we'll see that they arise again and again, they're always rebelling against the Muslim ruler of their time. So now after Uthman is killed, this group has now dispersed amongst the army of Ali. Remember, in Medina, they've come against Sayyidah Aisha. They may have been the same people that triggered the fight between Ali and Aisha, as we've seen. We can't be sure. Now, during the Battle of Siffin, this is where they very clearly now become a separate group for the first time. They separate and they go to Harura and they make a camp, and there's about 6,000 of them. So they've grown in size massively by this time. As we said, they declare the Sahaba to be kafir. They don't like personal authority. They don't like to recognize leadership. Well, somebody listen and obey. They're always going into disobedience and rebellion. And the funny thing is, they start rebelling against their own leaders as well. They're always rebelling against their own leaders. So one of the characteristics of this group is it's always splitting into more and more groups. Because as soon as they unite under a Khawarij leader, sooner or later, some of them start criticizing their own leader. This is a bizarre thing. So Sayyidina Ali was only Khalifa for 6 years. But by the time he died, that first group of Harurites, they had already split into 5 different groups. Within 6 years, they had already split into 5 different groups. So this is one of their clear characteristics. They would always start not only fighting against the leader of the Muslims, they were fighting against their own leaders. And they start declaring their own leaders to become kafir. So, I mean, you see this today. I mean, you know, these groups out there, you know, first you had Al-Qaeda declaring everyone to be kafir, then ISIS came and they started saying the Qaeda are kafir, and Al-Qaeda was saying the ISIS are kafir. And this is just a very, very thing that happens with these people all the time. Because it's just in their nature, they cannot, for some reason, they always rebel against the leader. They always think they know Islam better than anyone else. The earliest ones even challenged the Prophet, so you can imagine who they would challenge today. Then they challenged Sahaba, declared them to be disbelievers. The Prophet told us some of their characteristics. I think we've talked about them. The ones that appear towards the end of time will be young and stupid, means sufaha ahlam, they will be of dull intellect. They recite the Quran, but it does not go past their throats, and so on and so forth. Bukhari said that Sayyidina Ibn Umar used to regard them as the worst of all Allah's creatures. He said they take ayahs of Quran that refer to disbelievers and apply them to believers. Yeah. Ali fought them and defeated them in several battles. Some of them remained and their teaching lived on. They are the first deviant sect in Islam. This is also a very important point. There's no such thing as Shia. Don't tell me that the people with Ali are Shia at this time. How can Ibn Abbas, all these people, how can you call them Shia? The people of Ali are Sunnis, right? these Khawarij groups continued to stage rebellions against the Umayyads and the Abbasids. And on occasion, they succeeded in establishing Kharijite states, little areas which they had autonomous rule over, that we can call Kharijite states. And as I said, they constantly splinter into multiple factions, and they're known by many names. This is one of the reasons why they're hard to identify, because each different faction has their own different little name. But the ulama have very clearly categorized them under the umbrella term Khawarij, the Khawarij. And each faction believed that it is the only faction that knows Islam correctly, and everyone else is astray. Okay, was Ibn Taymiyyah influenced by Khawarij? I don't believe so, not Ibn Taymiyyah. The latest sort of notorious Khawarij preacher was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the Najd, and that's where the Saudi made alliance with him. And now, once again, I don't want to be putting any people down or trying to criticize any people. I know there are many Muslims, sincere Muslims, that have maybe even taken teachings from Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, or respect him, or read his books, or from his students. So, but you know, historical fact is historical fact. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was without doubt a Kharijite in his, and inshallah, that's part of the sort of article that I'm writing right now. But as I say, Ibn Taymiyyah was not. Ibn Taymiyyah was not. Ibn Taymiyyah was a Hanbali scholar, a great scholar. Some of the other ulama did criticize him on some of his points, but then all ulama have been criticized on certain points, you know, things like that. So yeah, I wouldn't class Ibn Taymiyyah as Khawarij in any way.